There's a hashtag that's been circulating on social media for quite a while now that asks people to hashtag explain your job poorly. And it has resulted in some pretty funny posts. I burst through your front door and spray all your things down with water. You usually thank me afterward, was the response of a firefighter. I arrange and sell pretty dying plants to panicked husbands who forgot their anniversary, said a florist. And of course, you know that a pastor had to get in on the action. They said, I write and present a book report on the exact same book week after week after week. If you stop and think about it, it is pretty wild that week after week, millions of people around the world gather together to discuss the same book that they have been discussing for centuries. Any normal social book club that did that would be hemorrhaging members after just a few weeks. And then you have the fact that the newest entries of this book were written nearly 2,000 years ago, and the oldest were first told in time immemorial. And yet, somehow, this ancient manuscript is still relevant and helpful, even though we live oh so very modern and complicated lives. And that's in part because the stories that it contains are universal. It speaks of themes that are inherently true when it comes to being a human, regardless of what year it might be. It speaks of sibling rivalry, mostly what we shouldn't do, a la Cain and Abel and Jacob and Esau and Joseph and his brothers. When we feel inadequate or under-equipped for the task that we have been given, we find that Moses and quite a few others have something to say about what we should do. The Bible speaks about fear and insecurity, of greed and jealousy, of longing for a better future, and wondering where God is in the midst of our pain and suffering. This book, while primarily being about the divine, is intrinsically a human saga, filled with human experiences, written to help humans feel not so alone or lost in the midst of whatever we might be experiencing. And that's one of the reasons that we decided to spend 3 weeks delving into the book of Acts, a book that's about normal people who, once Jesus had ascended into heaven, were left to try and figure out how to be the church together, something that I think we all are still trying to figure out how to do. Our story for today addresses some of the biggest questions about the human condition that we have. Is change possible? Is redemption possible? How should we respond when and if we are given a second chance? All of these questions are raised when we read the story of Paul's conversion on the road to Damascus. So let's get right to it. Can people change? Well, it really depends on who you ask. When you Google the phrase, "Is change possible?" the highlighted AI-generated summary of the top result reads, yes, you can change. So that's encouraging, right? There's also the fact that all of the cells in our bodies regenerate on average every 7 to 10 years, which means that technically you are a completely different person than you were back in 2014, molecularly speaking, that is. Psychologists are somewhat divided when it comes to the topic of change. There are some who believe that once we reach a certain age, our personalities are pretty much set. We can change a small habit here and there, but largely speaking, we are who we are at that point. Others believe that it's a bit more fluid. If you have ever taken the Myers-Briggs personality test, you might remember that the 4 pairs of contrasting traits are not either-or options, but rather represent 2 ends of a spectrum. And each of us falls somewhere along that spectrum, usually closer to one end or the other, but we have the ability to stretch into our non-dominant trait when needed. There's also the possibility of our positioning changing over time. I've personally seen my introvert-extrovert score shift over the years, usually depending on my living situation. with scoring very extroverted when I was living in dorms in college and in seminary, and slightly less extroverted when I was living off campus in grad school and when I first moved here to San Diego. And then there's the growing brain science research about the neuroplasticity of the human brain and how adaptable and malleable they are, as well as the pop psychology ideas like the 2190 rule, which suggests that it takes 21 days to build a new habit and 90 days to turn that habit into a lifestyle. Add all of those things up, and you've got pretty good evidence to say, yes, humans can, in fact, change. And yet, we all know how hard change can be. Without even needing to do a poll, I can guarantee that every single person in this room has tried and failed to implement at least one change, if not several changes, to ourselves and in our lives over the years. There's a reason that most New Year's resolutions fail, and that's because change is hard. It takes determination and grit and resilience. Muscle memory is a very real thing, both physical and mental, and it is dangerously easy to fall back into old habits, sometimes without even realizing it. Change is also hard because whether we succeed or fail isn't always entirely within our own control. There are so many different factors, internal and external, that make real, lasting change difficult to come by. Different people have differing levels of susceptibility to depression or addiction on a genetic level. People have varying access to treatment and professional help depending on their socioeconomic status, where they live, and the prevailing stigmas about seeking help versus pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. Additionally, when we talk about change as a topic, it can include everything from fixing a hitch in your golf swing to dealing with deep-seated anger issues to freeing yourself from the grips of an addictive substance. And when you take it all together, you end up with this incredibly complex and ultimately very human issue, the kind of issue for which we sure could use some divine guidance. Our reading for today introduces us to arguably one of the most famous Christians of all time, a man who founded numerous worshiping communities and who historically has been credited with writing 13 of the books contained in the New Testament, although recent scholarship says that number is probably closer to 7, with 3 being somewhat debated and the rest being written in his name but by someone else. The man that we know as St. Paul was born as Saul of Tarsus, which is a small city in south-central Turkey. He quickly rose through the ranks to become a very prominent and powerful Pharisee, a position that he used to persecute early followers of Jesus, also known as followers of the way, having them jailed and executed. One day, he's on his way to Damascus, and he has this incredible conversion experience. Jesus speaks to him. He is rendered blind for 3 days until he is healed by a disciple named Ananias, is baptized, and ultimately takes on a new name to go with his new identity. From that day on, Paul becomes one of the most passionate and dedicated disciples, even though, as he often says himself, he never actually got to meet Jesus in person. This story offers us clear, resounding evidence that change is indeed possible, with a little bit of divine help, of course, but we'll get back to that point in just a moment. Paul's situation raises some further difficult questions about the nature of change. Namely, do all of the good things that he did as Paul make up for all of the bad and terrible things that he did as Saul? Does this change that he underwent redeem him? Again, it kind of depends on who you're asking. If you're asking the people that he helped to find faith, those whom he inspired and guided through his teachings and wisdom, chances are they would say yes. If you're asking the friends and the the family members of those that he sent to jail and had executed? I'm not sure what their answer would be. Some understandably would say no. His change of heart doesn't make up for all of the evil that he did. Others might feel differently. Now, history has shown us numerous instances where those who have suffered incredible evil and great injustice were able to simultaneously hold their grief and anger while also offering the perpetrator of those acts love and grace and forgiveness. When it comes to change and redemption, there's a line from Ted Lasso, which is one of my favorite TV shows that immediately comes to mind. Coach Lasso says in an episode towards the end of season 3, "I hope that either all of us or none of us are judged by the actions of our weakest moments, but rather by the strength we show when and if we're given a second chance." I hope that either all of us or none of us are judged by the actions of our weakest moments, but rather by the strength we show when and if we're given a second chance. It speaks to the fact that we are all human. We all make mistakes. We all say and do things that we wish we hadn't, that make us shudder with embarrassment and regret later on in life. And yet we have a choice. We have the choice to change, or at least try to change, to not let that shame immobilize us, but rather to allow it to inspire us to do better next time. And whether or not that earns us redemption in the eyes of others, which is something that truly is outside of our control, we can know in our heart of hearts that we did everything we could to be a better version of ourselves, something that we hope would at least earn us redemption in the eyes of God. But unfortunately, and I hate to be the bearer of bad news, it doesn't redeem us in the eyes of God. The actions of Paul do not redeem the misdeeds of Saul. None of us are redeemed in the eyes of God by doing just enough good to counterbalance the evil that we have wrought. And that's because God took care of our redemption a long, long time ago, in and through the person of Jesus. We are redeemed not by our own actions or will or desire to change, but rather by the life, death, and resurrection of the one who would die on a cross for our sake, for the sake of showing us how unconditionally loved we are, the one who calls us to turn from our baser instincts and follow him in the way of truth and life and grace. For we have a God who knows that we are not perfect, who loves us nevertheless, and yet has also given us the capacity to change, not as a means of earning that redemption, but because we have already been redeemed. And the true blessing of this whole change business is that we don't have to do it all by ourselves. God is there to help us and guide us and inspire us and pick us up off the ground after we fall flat on our faces. Now, that being said, there are still some stark realities that we need to acknowledge about change. For starters, it doesn't happen overnight. One of the podcasts that Alyssa listens to likes to say that if it took you 20 years to walk into the woods, you can't expect yourself to walk out in just 2 days. Based on our story for today, we actually know it takes 3 days, right? And not of walking, but of sitting with scales on your eyes. And then after that, it's instantaneous, right? If only that were the case. Habits and our general way of being in the world that have formed over years, decades, those are going to take some time to correct and change. But we shouldn't shy away from the task simply because it won't provide us with instant gratification. And there's something to be said about Paul's spending time in quiet reflection and introspection, both of which are key ingredients in creating lasting change in our lives. I think it's also important to acknowledge that change will cost us things. Saul probably had a lot of friends that he lost as a result of his conversion. people who couldn't understand or agree with the change that he underwent. He essentially lost his whole life, which I'm sure was something that he needed to properly acknowledge and grieve at some point. But all of that pales in comparison to what he gained as a result of his change, as well as what he would have lost had he not changed in the first place. Every Sunday, when we come to this book club that's still stuck on and fascinated by the same stories and the same book that we have been talking about for centuries, we are reminded that the Bible is a human book, filled with human stories. And this story in particular is included not just because it happened, or because it's fun to have an origin story about the man who would go on to shape the Christian faith in such profound ways. No, it is included because it is a story of inspiration and of hope. The hope that change is indeed possible for all of us. Not guaranteed, not easy, not without cost, not even necessarily permanent, but it is possible. Possible with the grace, help, and love of God. Amen.